Our faces, streaked with dust and filth and sweat, stared across the ruined, apocalyptic landscape through which we were advancing, more interested in quiet corners for a few moments of sleep than in Russian strays. Explosions from the forefront of our advance were continuously shaking the air around us and compressing our weakened lungs. No one spoke, except for an occasional halt or Achtung, which threw us down onto the burning ground. We were so exhausted that we stood up only when our fire had subdued the isolated and hopeless resistance from some entrenched hold. Sometimes, one or two prisoners might emerge from their hideout with their hands in the air, and each time the same tragedy repeated itself. Kraus killed 4 of them on the lieutenant's orders. The Sudeten, 2, Group 17, 9. Young Lindbergh, who had been in a state of panic ever since the beginning of the offensive, and who had been either weeping in terror or laughing in hope, took Kraus's machine gun and shoved 2 Bolsheviks into a shell hole. The 2 wretched victims were both a good deal older than the boy, and kept imploring his mercy. We could hear their desperate shouts for a long time, but Lindbergh, in a paroxysm of uncontrollable rage, kept firing until they were quiet. Then there was the bread house, so called because after the massacre, we found a few wretched biscuits there, which we devoured, hoping to extract some return for the horrors which the war forced upon us. We were mad with harassment and exhaustion, running on our nerves, which were stretched to the utmost, and which alone made it possible to respond to the endless succession of crises and alerts. We were forbidden to take prisoners until our return trip. We knew that the Russians didn't take any, and although we longed for sleep, we knew that we had to stay awake as long as there were any Bolsheviks in our sector. It was either them or us, which is why my friend Hals and I threw grenades into the bread house at some Russians who were trying to wave a white flag. When we reached the end of our sweep, we collapsed at the bottom of a large crater and stared at each other for a long time in dazed silence. None of us could speak. Our uniforms were unbuttoned, torn, and so permeated with dust they were the color of the ground. The air still roared and shook and smelled of burning. 4 more of our men had been killed, and we were dragging along 5 or 6 wounded, one of them Ollensheim. There were about 20 of us, huddled in that huge hole, trying to put our thoughts into some kind of order, but our stupefied eyes continued to wander vacantly over the burned landscape, and our heads remained empty. The radio announced that our Belgorod offensive had been crowned with success and marked the beginning of our further progress eastward. We began to organize our position among the poor, half-ruined houses of the hamlet. Our first job was to get rid of some 30 Bolshevik corpses scattered through the rubble. We dumped them into a small garden. The day was hot and heavy. A greasy sun threw sharp shadows and made us squint in the harsh light, which emphasized every hollow in our exhausted faces. The same light poured down onto the faces of the dead Russians, whose fixed eyes were open inordinately wide. Looking at them and thinking about us all made my stomach turn over. "Isn't it funny," the Sudeten remarked calmly, "how quickly a fellow's beard grows when he's dead? Look at this one." He turned over a body with his foot. This man's tunic was torn by 7 or 8 bloody holes. He probably shaved yesterday just before he was killed. And look at him now. He's got a beard on him that would have taken him at least a week otherwise. "See this one," laughed another fellow, who was clearing out a building which had been hit by a heavy mortar shell. He was dragging a Russian soldier whose head had been blown off. "You do better to go and shave yourself if you want anyone to recognize you when it's your turn tomorrow. You give me a pain with your idiotic remarks. Anyone would think that's the first stiff you've ever seen." The veteran sat down on a heap of rubble and opened his mess tin. We found a cellar which made a perfect defense point and moved into it with our 2 machine guns. We dug out the air vent which had been blocked by the collapse of the house and even enlarged it, stopping work for a moment to watch a flight of Stukas pass overhead. Somewhere, not too far away, Ivan must have been drenched by a rain of bombs. Hals had made a hole in the masonry walls and was estimating the firing possibilities. Lindbergh was almost jubilant to be setting up this precarious shelter. Everything which now seemed to be working to our advantage stirred him to a strange excitement, in contrast to the helpless fear in the flaming alleys of Belgorod. 3 yards away, the veteran and I were shoving in supports to brace the enlarged air vent, which at best seemed a shaky proposition. Whenever we moved, our helmets scraped against the low ceiling. Behind us, Kraus and 2 other grenadiers were removing the fallen stones and rubble which littered the floor. One of them picked up an empty bottle and with a civilian reflex stood it against the wall to wait for the harvest. As I said, we had lost our non-com, and the veteran, who was an Obergefreiter, was now commanding our group. However, we were still under the orders of a fat Stabsfeldwebel who directed all 3 groups, and who was killed 2 days later. He checked our work with all the airs of a superior officer, forcing us to check this detail or that, unaware that he had only 48 hours left. We spent the day waiting and watching companies of sweating troops march by, against a continuous background of heavy explosions and a variety of other noises. It was in precisely these moments that everything became intensely painful. As we slowly regained our spirits, we began to grasp what had happened to us. It suddenly struck us that our non-com, and Grumpers and the Czech and the wounded boy abandoned to his fate were in fact no longer with us. We tried to blot out the memory of the Russian trench we had machine-gunned, and the tanks driving heavily over that moving mass of human flesh, at the Troika with its piles of Bolshevik corpses, and the hammering of enemy artillery in the narrow of streets crammed with Hitler Youth. All the appalling, inexplicable details. We suddenly felt gripped by something horrible, which made our skins crawl and our hair stand on end. For me, these memories produced a loss of physical sensation, almost as if my personality had split. I knew that I was actually incapable of such experiences, not because I was superior to other people, but because I knew that such things don't happen to young men who have led normal lives more or less like other people's. The 3 grenadiers stood talking beside the staircase. The veteran, alone by the air vent, through which floods of sunlight poured into the room, was going through his pockets, spreading out their wretched contents on a flat stone. Hals had curled his big body onto a rough bench and was lying silent, while Lindbergh and the Sudeten were staring through holes in the wall with their minds clearly far away. I went over to Hals and lay down beside him. We stared at each other for a moment, unable to speak. "What are we doing here?" Hals said finally. His face had grown noticeably harder since Bialystok. I limited myself to a gesture of ignorance. "I'd like to sleep, but I can't," he said. "We really were idiots to kill those Popovs in the bread house." He was clearly desperately troubled by the same things that troubled me. "The bread house is how it is, and all there is," I answered. I could feel the cartridges still running through my hands, see them entering the Spandau, and see the bluish, smoking metal of the barrel and the sparks that flew out each time the gun fired, painfully striking my hands and face, and hear the shrieks penetrating the infernal din, and the cries for help. "Pomosh! Pomosh!" Something hideous had entered our spirits, to remain and haunt us forever. It was broad daylight, but we had no idea what time it was. Was it still morning? Was it afternoon? It did not matter. Everyone ate and drank what he could, slept when he could, and tried to think whenever he could take off his helmet. It's strange how much a helmet interferes with thought. It was still daylight when an enemy barrage ripped into the orchard and the advancing troops, who had stopped only a short distance from us. We dived into our cellar shelter and stared anxiously at the ceiling, which rained down plaster with each explosion. "We'll have to shore it up too," said the veteran. "If anything lands too close, the whole thing will come down on our heads." The bombardment lasted for at least 2 hours. A few Soviet shells fell right beside us, and they were clearly intended for the assault troops. Our big guns answered theirs, and all other sounds were drowned in the noise of artillery. Shells from our howitzer were shooting right over our ruin, contributing as much to the collapse of our ceiling as the Russian shells, which sometimes burst less than 30 yards away. During the bombardment, we were all gripped by an extreme and exhausting tension. Some of us attempted predictions, only to be contradicted by events a few moments later. The veteran smoked nervously, continuously begging us to shut up. Kraus had drawn apart and sat muttering in a corner. Perhaps he was praying. In the evening, one of the counterattack units visited us and installed an anti-tank gun nearby. A colonel came by a little later and tested the new supports we had put in to prevent any further collapse of the roof. "Well done," he said. He made the rounds of our little group, offering each man a cigarette. Then he rejoined his unit, which was part of the Grossdeutschland, a little closer to the front. It grew dark. Through the tattered silhouettes of the remaining orchard trees, the horizon glowed red with fire. The battle was not yet over, and the extreme tension it generated was almost unbearable. We had to take turns standing guard outside, and no one had a good night's sleep. We were rounded up well before dawn and forced to abandon our well-organized hole and proceeded further into Soviet territory. The German advance had not been stopped. During our advance, we crossed a frightful slaughtering ground of Hitler Youth, mixed into the dirt by the bombardment of the day before. Each step made us realize with fresh horror what could become of our miserable flesh. "Somebody should have buried all this mincemeat so we wouldn't have to look at it," Halls grumbled. Everyone laughed, as if he had said something funny. We crossed a piece of ground so heavily pitted with shell holes it was hard to imagine that anyone who had been on it could have survived, and an open-air hospital behind an embankment from which the shrieks and groans came so thick and fast it sounded like a scalding room for pigs. We were staggered by what we saw. I thought I would faint. Lindbergh was crying with terror. We crossed the enclosure with our eyes fixed on the sky, seeing as if in a dream young men howling with pain, with crushed forearms or gaping abdominal wounds, staring with incomprehension at their own guts, puffing out the piece of cloth which had been hastily flung over them. Immediately beyond the hospital, we had to wade across a canal. The cool water which rose over our waists made us feel much better. On the far bank, the springing turf was strewn with Russian bodies. A Soviet tank, twisted and blackened by fire, stood beside a big gun and the shattered bodies of its operators. To our left and the northeast, the battle continued more fiercely than ever. We thought we heard a groan from one of the Russian gunners and went over to a man smeared with blood who was leaning, gasping against one of the wheels of the gun carriage. One of our men uncorked his drinking bottle and lifted the head of the dying man. The Russian stared at us through enormous eyes, widened by terror or shock. He cried out, and then his head fell back, thudding against the metal of the wheel. He was dead.